carrying. It's an ongoing thing. I'm not saying that those of us who have been in the ICOC have learned everything we're supposed to learn or are appropriately humble. I don't know how I can judge that anymore. I mean, someone asked me, I was in Asia a few weeks ago, and said, so tell us what your blind spots are. I do my blind spots and wouldn't be blind. I don't claim to be objective. Another thing, I wish I had said this in the first part, is we're not trying to imply that people are bad-hearted. We're not trying to pronounce judgment on people's motives. 1 Corinthians 4, Paul says he doesn't even judge his own motives. It's very hard to do. Very rarely is it clear what's going on. I give the benefit of the doubt to my brothers and sisters in the Churches of Christ and in the ICOC. I just had to say that. Okay.
It's still us. This is being audio recorded, so we wanted to introduce ourselves one more time.
Change position, so maybe we should go.
I'm Nick Zola. I teach New Testament at Pepperdine University.
I'm Douglas Jacoby, and I don't. Long posted.
It is indeed. We'll just, for a very quick moment, remind you what we just ended with, and then continue on into this next section. There are a great number of positive things that occurred in the international churches of Christ in the decades from the mid-60s up until the early 2000s. And there are a series of very unhealthy things. And I think it probably is important to say, which we may not have made explicit, that there may well still be unhealthy things occurring in the international church of Christ, as there are unhealthy things that continue to occur in the churches of Christ. And so we don't want to leave you with the impression that everything has been fixed on either end of this conversation. Right? So let's make sure that that is clear. All right. Let's see. So here's our plan for this second session. Last time we did the DDD, right? The dates, the DNA, and the damage. Now we're PPP. Like good preachers are. Purposes, progress, and practice. So we want to talk about what progress has been made, and our focus in particular is what progress has been made in the organizational structure of the International Churches of Christ and in the communication that has begun to reoccur between the Churches of Christ and the International Churches of Christ. We'll remind you about what our purposes are in this, and then we're going to leave with some potential ideas, some practicals about how we can continue to dialogue.
So, questions.
And yes, and we'll leave extra time for questions this time. Here's what we're not doing, and here's what we don't want to accomplish, although we wouldn't mind, I suppose. It is not our goal that we end agreeing on everything, right? Agreement cannot be the goal. We will simply not achieve that. So it is not the goal that we come at the end, I would say, obviously, but even in the next 10 years or something like that, and have the Church of Christ and the International Church of Christ come to agreement on all issues. That's not what we expect to happen. Nor is it our imagination that the International Churches of Christ and the Churches of Christ will all somehow merge together magically again, or something like that. Again, not that we would be opposed to the idea that churches begin to merge and work together, but that is not our purpose in doing this. Our purpose instead is...
Because after all, it's hard enough even for two ICOCs to merge, two Churches of Christ to merge. It just takes the littlest thing, or the most obstinate person, but we can affirm our Christian unity. And I think we've spoken about education. I want people to know our past, our common shared history, to talk to each other, and to show humility. And that will lead to not reinventing the wheel. That will lead to sharing resources. A question I frequently ask as I travel around the world in local churches, I say, well, what outside speakers have you had in? Have you taken advantage of the Christian churches or the Churches of Christ? These guys who really know the Bible, or others who can help you? Oh, no, we don't trust anyone else. We do it. That's very much like marrying your cousin a few generations, and you'll be like the royal houses of Europe in the previous centuries.
Move on to the next slide.
Oh, right. So, Nick has called this a year of apologies. And yet, in 2003, many would say there was no apology, or it was insufficient, or it was, okay, we're sorry about that, we're going to do better now. Because normally, if you really mess up, you just get out of the way and you let someone else take over. You don't stay at the helm. And so we are very similarly. Some people think that we're being too kind, too gentle, dismissive in this class, and others may think that we're being reactionary or too harsh. But it's hard to find the right balance. Yearly conferences, particularly with church leaders and elders, started happening almost as soon as what is sometimes called the tsunami or the implosion, or what's your term?
The Creek letter.
Yeah. And I have to say, I don't blame Henry. He's a great guy. I say it's like an avalanche in the Alps. There's some yodeler walking up on the top, and he accidentally kicks a piece of snow. There's an avalanche, and you can blame him. But really, the thing was unstable before, so you don't blame the yodeler. Reconciliation talks at the lectureship at ACU. This is great.
So in 2004, what occurs, and this is actually part of what eventually convinces me to go get a degree at Adventist Christian University, is that they have, for the first time in maybe over a decade, members from the International Churches of Christ come to the yearly Abilene Christian University lectureship and sit down with members of the Churches of Christ and have a dialogue. They apologize on both sides for ways that they had castigated the other. The International Church of Christ members apologize for the ways that they referred to the Church of Christ as dead and as no longer Christians. The Churches of Christ apologize for the ways that they referred to the International Church of Christ as a cult and as a sectarian, divided movement that is no longer in the realm of kind of biblical understanding. And so this was, at least, I think what was called at the time, a first date in terms of reestablishing connections. Although I will say also that dialogue did not seem to recontinue or reconnect in years after that at Abilene. What did happen, though, next is in 2005, at this very lectureship, at that point run by Jerry Rushford hosted another dialogue between Andy Fleming of the International Churches of Christ and Jeff Walling of the Churches of Christ. And I love the title of this, and Doug mentioned this at the beginning. The title that Jerry gave to this is the International Church of Christ and the Church of Christ, Renewing an Interrupted Family Conversation, which is very much in keeping with how both of us have intended this presentation to be. Renewing an interrupted family conversation. That we were part of the same family once, and we broke off, and we have the chance at least to begin talking to each other again. Not that there isn't more to work out.
So Andy Fleming is from a Church of Christ background, and Jeff Walling again at the conference here. I mean, he's such an amazing fellow, so supportive and positive. Jeff loves what's happening in the ICOC. We spent a couple hours together 2 days ago. It was so encouraging. Andy loves the Church of Christ. Now, he's very realistic. He'll say, well, they're not growing, and they are, and that guy's got an attitude and this. But we've got our issues in the ICOC, too. We're called to love each other, whatever we think of each other. And many of the names you see on here are men who are just excellent at loving. And those of you who are in the room,
some of you were present right now.
Right. You are to be commended.
Yes. In 2006, the initiation discussions happened earlier, 2005, and maybe even earlier than that. But in 2006, what is published, is a plan for united cooperation among the remaining members and leaders of the International Churches of Christ. This plan is eventually ratified by over 95% of the existing churches in the International Churches of Christ. And so this becomes, and remember I was using this terminology earlier, the ICOC 1.0, you could say, is kind of the pre-version before 2000, ICOC 2.0. So this is when we move into kind of ICOC 2.0 range, if you want to think of it that way. The ICOC is beginning to restructure itself. Now this is a slide that has a lot of text on it. I'm not going to go in a great deal of detail at all of this, but I wanted just to run through with you, especially for those of you who are here who are not part of the conversation within the ICOC, about what has happened in the last decade or so. And there are probably people present here who could speak to this far more legitimately than I can, and I acknowledge that. In 2007 and beyond, a delegate system and a service team system is established. So the ICOC leaders create a delegate system such that depending on how large your church is or how many churches you have in a particular geographic area, you send delegates to help make decisions as a whole. In other words, the ICOC is attempting to move towards a kind of consensus-based leadership model, almost a democratic-based leadership model. They create service teams, and these are divided into various categories: evangelists, teachers, elders. Not all of these exist as early as 2007, but some get added on later. Missions, campus, youth and family, benevolence, women, administration, communication, and so forth. Service teams that have individual leaders within those teams that are tasked with making sure, for instance, in the teaching ministry, that the teaching ministry continues within the larger group of the international churches of Christ. By 2010, that delegate system has been formalized and kind of ratified as within the churches that are part of this cooperation agreement and that are voting. And then some key moments. I'm just going to highlight a couple key areas. In 2012, San Antonio hosted what they called the World Discipleship Summit. I was still living in Texas at the time, so I was able to attend that. Over 17,000 people from the International Churches of Christ attended this, and importantly, it also had people from the Churches of Christ and even from the Christian churches, the independent Christian churches, who were present there as well. And so, in many ways, the Churches of Christ, the International Churches of Christ, are beginning to reach out to their fellow brothers and sisters in the larger Stone Campbell Restoration movement, and this is already happening before that as well, I should say. This is, in a sense, a new watershed moment, you might say, in the International Churches of Christ. This is a point where I think the International Churches of Christ begins to see that they are a group again, that they are growing again to some degree, that they have a unified body of believers in the world, and that unified body of believers wants to work together to cooperate and to rebuild some of what they had and to make it better than it was.
Clarification. So the growing again, I think, going from 90,000, growing by about 20,000 to just over 110,000. So that's not, it's small growth in one way, but it's not insignificant.
Correct. Yeah. 4 years later, they have a second conference. This time they call it the North American Discipleship Summit because they also have summits in various other countries in the world. But the one in St. Louis, I think, becomes more of a kind of dominating narrative for that particular group of conferences. Again, for instance, Jeff Walding, who we've just mentioned, is a speaker at this conference. Other people, so I was present at this conference as a representative of Lincoln Christian University when I was a professor at Lincoln Christian University. So coming from the Christian churches at that point, representing our university at that conference. And so they are beginning to reach out. The ICOC is beginning to reach out further than it had been in the past. Both of those conferences have relatively positive write-ups that occur in the Christian Chronicle, which is a Church of Christ publication. And so somebody from the Christian Chronicle attends the ICOC conference, is invited personally by Roger Lamb, writes up a report, and it's a fairly positive report. At this point, a global missions report is released in 2016. By this point, the ICOC has now redivided the world into 32 regional families in the sense of these are where the ICOC churches are located. And these are 32 regional families that are now working together and cooperating together for world missions. And then that leads us up to just last year, in 2018, in Panama, a fairly significant vote occurred. The leadership and the delegates and the service teams were envisioning and considering how to structure the International Churches of Christ. One plan that was on the table was more of a global leadership plan, and another was more of a regional leadership plan. The entire plan was referred to as ICOC 3.0, so this is actually internal terminology to some degree. And the vote that occurs eventually focuses more on the regional idea of structure than the global idea of structure.
Which involves sharing resources, financial, people, wouldn't have been a throwback to the old system,
Right.
but it would have taken us definitely some distance.
Yeah, closer, yeah. So again, it's not, there's no hint of returning to a single person leading an entire group of churches or anything like that. But it is telling, I think, that enough members in the ICOC were uncomfortable with a more global plan that they preferred a more regional plan, bringing them closer in line to the way that the churches of Christ tend to structure themselves, although certainly not the same. For instance, there's far more cooperation within the international churches of Christ in terms of missions and benevolence work and so forth that churches of Christ do not generally participate in. So that, you could say, goes from ICOC 2.0 to 3.0 back down to 2.1 is the terminology that I have seen used.
And we admit this is simplified, oversimplified.
Yes,
but you didn't want more detail. I'm probably not there. You know, in the Restoration movement, this was a hot issue in the 19th century. There were a number of hot issues, but one of them was the cooperation issue.
Yeah.
We want to evangelize the world. Are we allowed to establish a missionary society, which in essence would be above the church level? Or if we do that, are we not on the road to building the Vatican in our own movement? Interestingly, I mean, this is the Restoration movement. On the way here, you walk right past the desk, the pulpit, the preaching pulpit of Alexander Campbell. You didn't notice it, you will on the way out when you get your picture taken there. But this cooperation issue has always been a tough one in the Restoration movement. So, a little excursus. Kip had to step down from leadership for various reasons, ended up moving to Portland. If you can look in the square in the bottom left there. Came to the ICOC meetings, but basically eventually thought, I'm going to start my own thing. Now that's a very abbreviated way of describing it, but it's true. And he decided to call it the International Christian Church. The thing is, we used to be called the ICC, which I thought, you know, it's Interstate Commerce Commission. That's not helpful. Someone added the ON, and then you have the independent Christian churches who are ICC, but now this is called the International Christian Church. So it's been going 10 years or so. They have, I guess they're heading up towards 70 churches. It's around the world. Often they're baptizing people, but they're also reclaiming disaffected members of the ICOC.
I think that, unfortunately, the best way to understand and to characterize Kip's new movement is to say that Kip McKean is doing to the ICOC precisely what the ICOC did to the churches of Christ. In other words, during the 80s, when the ICOC began to call out the remnant and to make declarations that the churches of Christ are dead and are no longer growing and in fact are no longer even Christians, and if you want to be part of anything real, you need to come and join us, that is unfortunately precisely what Kip McKean and the international Christian churches are doing to the ICOC now. So history repeats itself.
Let me just mention two more things on this screen. In the Crossroads era, as all these young people becoming Christians, and sometimes their elders, their older people are not excited, how do we refer to ourselves? Well, we're trying to be totally committed. And that was a phrase that you heard a lot in the Crossroads era, being totally committed. Although, I mean, what's the difference between total commitment and committed to committed? Okay. In a sense, to distinguish the Boston movement from Crossroads and even from the rest of the Restoration movement, as I mentioned, in the early 80s, the word disciple was latched upon. And now, in this next iteration in the International Christian Church, the phrase is the sold out disciples. So are you sold out? Or are you just a disciple? Well, of course, sold out disciple is not a phrase that appears in the New Testament. Key doctrines, and this is in print, you are following a false Jesus if you have no discipling partner. If your church is not led by an evangelist who must be under the authority of Kip McKean. Now, he wouldn't necessarily say that directly, but your church leader has to be discipled by an evangelist in a different church, and ultimately that is underneath one person. And third, unless you agree that the Bible says we must evangelize the world in one generation. I think all three of those are highly debatable. But those are the key distinctive doctrines, as I would look at it. Would you add?
No,